It seems like it has long been true that often local church leaders are more biblical. Small towns, flyover country, metropolitan areas have good Bible-believing churches, but they have a lot of liberal churches too. The reason I went that way is it seems like in Jesus' day, the liberals ran the temple. The Jews who believed in the Old Testament, there were some of them who lived in Jerusalem, some of the priests, but very often they're like John the Baptist's dad, who's like outside the temple system. The chief priests that were come upon them tended to be very liberal in that time. In fact, I think we would be surprised at how liberal they really were 2,000 years ago. We'll continue now with Luke chapter 20. Jesus has been teaching in the temple. He probably took up a lecture hall. There was what was called Solomon's porch. Lots of pillars. They were covered. There were rooms in them. Some of them were lecture halls. And they come to him and ask him by what authority does he have to do these things, probably a reference to driving out the money changers. What authority did he have to take up a lecture hall and start talking about God? Who gave him the authority to teach in the temple lecture hall? And then he asked them, where did John the Baptist come from? Now, they were in trouble because if they said from God, then John the Baptist said that Jesus was the Messiah. If they said John the Baptist was a fake, that would make the majority of people mad, so they didn't have any answer at all. Jesus kept teaching. He gave a parable about if a king went away on a trip and he gave the attendants to take care of his place. He kept sending people back. They killed them all. Then they killed the son. And this was a reference to the temple did belong to God, and he would send prophets, and they would kill all the prophets. Then they finally sent his son, who was an heir. And in the story, they were going to kill him. And right there were these chief priests already plotting to kill Jesus. They sent to him another group. Luke doesn't give their name. Mark says it was Herodians. The Herodians were for the Herod family and did not like the Roman Empire. And so they didn't want to pay any taxes. So they came up and they were trying to trick him to agree with them on rebelling against Rome and not paying any taxes. So they're trying to get him to go both ways. And you'll remember, show me the picture of the coin whose image is on it, and Caesar's image is on it. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. And that seemed to look like separation of church and state, which actually is not very common throughout history. But Moses started out that way, governing people by the book of the law and not so much a king. We come to the next objection and the critics. They seem to be standing right there, one after another. It's the same place and same occasion of those we've already studied. We get to Luke 20, verse 27, and out come the Sadducees. Now, we're familiar with Pharisees and Sadducees. They all opposed Jesus, but they didn't like each other very well either. The Sadducees next give the objection, and it's about life after death. It's about the resurrection from the dead. So let's read verse 27. Luke 20:27. Now there came to him some of the Sadducees, parenthesis, who say there is no resurrection. See, I would assume that we would think, without looking into it, that the temple leaders in Jesus' day were very conservative. No, they weren't. They were very liberal. Some of the priests were Bible believers. like Zacharias, John the Baptist's father. Some were, but the people who actually ran things in the temple were very, very liberal. The Pharisees believed in life after death. The Pharisees believed that the soul would depart and live on. The Pharisees believed that eventually there would be a bodily resurrection. But the Pharisees were business people. They were not the priests. The Sadducees were the chief priests. And they were very, very liberal. The religious system would promote their liberalism. Kind of hard to think it's that way. I do think if we're not careful, sometimes the denominational headquarters can be quite liberal, whereas people in the towns are not as liberal. You're having that in the last few years where the denominations of the Presbyterians and the Methodists especially have gone very liberal, and you have local churches all over the place pulling out. That's the right thing to do, to pull out. And I have heard even this week some of the Methodists now are pulling out of the Methodist church. The Presbyterians were a couple of years ago pulling out because the liberal system ran the temple in Jesus' day. They were the chief priests. They loved the ceremonies. They liked the robes. They liked the trumpets. They liked the candles. They liked the recitation and chanting and the choirs. Acts 23:8 says, in addition, the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor angels, nor spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So in addition, there's no life after death to a Sadducee. There's no resurrection. There's no such thing as an angel. There's no such thing as a demon. Whoa. See, we would not immediately think how liberal the temple system was. But it was basically ceremonies run by people that liked to show off and run by people that didn't believe hardly anything. We can think of good high priests in the Old Testament times, but after the time of Moses, we come to Samuel's time, and we have Eli. And Eli was in the middle, but the sons of Eli were very, very immoral, even running the temple. In the book of Jeremiah, it was the high priest who put him in prison. Pashur, the son of Emer, Jeremiah chapter 20, wanted Jeremiah in prison. Archaeologists have found references to him. Same thing in Jesus' time. Annas and son-in-law Caiaphas. They were historical people. We know them from outside the Bible, and they were very, very liberal. No life after death, no resurrection, no such thing as an angel, no such thing as a demon. We just wouldn't think that. We would think that 2,000 years ago, that running the temple, they would be very, very conservative. Very, very liberal. Now they're going to come up with a little story. And they're going to come up with a little story to challenge Jesus, that they don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe in the life after death. So they make up this little story, this fiction, and to them it makes the idea of life after death seem ridiculous. Verse 28 begins the story. And they, the Sadducees, questioned Jesus, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote that for us, if a man's brother dies having a wife and he is childless, his brother should marry the wife and raise up children to his brother." You have the brother's family name. Now there were 7 brothers, and the first took a wife and died childless, and the second and the third married her, and in the same way all 7 died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman died also. In the resurrection, therefore, which one's wife shall she be? For all 7 had married her. This is their fictional story. It's supposed to be the logic of reduction to the absurd. This looks like an absurd story. This can't possibly happen. If this can't possibly be true, then there is no life after death. There is no resurrection. We are not under the law of Moses, so nothing he wrote applies to us unless it's repeated in the New Testament. It is true the law of Moses said that if a man died and he had no children, that his wife should marry the brother. That is true that the Old Testament times had this, Deuteronomy 25:5. So the Sadducees have that part correct, and they make up the story about one brother dies, brother two dies, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they all died, and she keeps getting passed around. The widow keeps getting passed around. Then in a hypothetical resurrection, to whom will she be married? And this hypothetical story is supposed to reduce life after death to an absurd situation. They thought it made the resurrection of the future look ridiculous. Well, Jesus is going to make their story look ridiculous. We do want to go in a different direction for a modern application. They said Moses wrote the law. Nowadays, lots of people said Moses didn't write it. But we're going to have in this story, the liberals believe Moses wrote the law, and Jesus believed Moses wrote the law. So our main section today will be on life after death, but every once in a while we'll bring in that Moses was the author of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And liberals today don't believe that, but even here, the liberal Sadducees did believe that Moses is the author. Now, Jesus will begin the answer to their fictional story, supposed to reduce life after death to the absurd. Verse 34. And Jesus said to them, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to obtain that age and resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. For neither can they die anymore, for they are like the angels, and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. This hypothetical illustration that to the Sadducees it made life after death seem ridiculous. It was a ridiculous illustration, because Jesus says that in the future we will be like the angels. We won't have any more kids. Angels are the same in number. None of them ever die, and none of them ever have babies. So they're the same in number, and the angels are not in families. They live forever, and someday the believers will live forever, but we won't be in families. So this hypothetical story about this widow that keeps getting passed down to the oldest brother, the second oldest brother, this hypothetical make-believe story is absolutely irrelevant to everything. Now, Jesus will next give the story of Moses and the burning bush, arguing that the Old Testament does teach life after death. So the Sadducees are very, very liberal, but I'd like to explain why Jesus finds something from Moses. Did not the Old Testament teach life after death? Well, of course it does teach life after death in many, many places. But wanting to sound really holy, the Sadducees had been saying, we have to have it from Moses. We can't have it from any other book. We have to have it from Moses. And unless you Pharisees can come up with lines from Moses that there's life after death, we're not going to believe you. The Pharisees had argued with them that there is life after death. And the Pharisees had quoted, say, the book of Job. Job is a very old book. The story goes back perhaps to the time of the patriarchs, way before Moses. Job 19, 25 and 26, as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives. He will take his stand on the earth. Even after my skin is destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. So Job 19 had resurrection in it. But the Sadducees said, that's not Moses. We don't like the book of Job. That's not Moses. Psalm 16 has life after death. King David believed in life after death. You will not abandon my soul to the grave. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forever. So King David, you will not abandon me to the grave, and in your presence is fullness of joy forever. King David believed in life after death, and the Sadducees would say, that's not Moses. So you have Job and you have Moses. Daniel believed in life after death. Daniel 12, 1 and 2. Many of these in the dust of the earth will awake, these to everlasting life and others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Now, Daniel 12 is talking about the tribulation period, so he says many at the time of the tribulation will arise, but others at different times. But in the end, Daniel did teach a resurrection, and he did teach a resurrection of everybody, some to life, some to death. So the Pharisees had for generations come along, no, the Bible teaches life after death. The Old Testament does. It teaches it in the book of Job. It teaches it in the book of Psalms. It teaches it in the book of Samuel. And the Sadducees were saying, Moses never taught it. We're not going to believe anything like this unless Moses taught it. And up to that time, the Pharisees had never come up with a verse from Moses, that a Mosaic verse taught life after death. I did this review on purpose because Jesus shuts them up. Now, the sermon today, the main truth is life after death, but right here, I kind of wanted to go this newer direction. Jesus, absolute genius. Wrong one to argue with. The Pharisees and the Sadducees have been arguing for centuries over this. And Sadducees, we've got to have it from Moses. We don't believe Job. We don't believe Daniel. We don't believe even King David in the Psalms. We've got to have Moses. And Jesus is going to say, in the very common, well-known story of the burning bush, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were still alive 600 years after their death, and God was still their God. And the Sadducees are going to shut up and walk away and not know what to do. We will read on, but we get to verse 39 where it kind of says, you have spoken well, and they walk off. Let's continue reading now in verse 37. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the burning bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. Some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well, for they did not have courage to question him any longer about anything. At the burning bush, God did not say, I was 600 years ago the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. After their death, 500 to 600 years in the past, God said, I am still the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Meaning that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still worship God. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been gone 600 years ago, but they still followed God. They still served God. They were still present. So the Sadducees had been waiting. We have to have it from Moses. We don't believe any other part of the Old Testament about life after. We have to have it from Moses. And Jesus comes along. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They died 600 years ago, but they still worship me. They still serve me. They still follow me. I am still their God. And these Pharisees don't know what to do. They're like, well, that's that. Wrong one to ask any questions. And Jesus is going to keep teaching, but they're not going to answer him any more questions. They're not going to challenge him again. Jesus is going to start teaching them at the close, where David in Psalm 110 says, "The Lord said to my Lord," there are two Lords, therefore, in the Old Testament. Who are the two Lords? So Jesus will keep on talking, and Jesus will keep on showing them he has the answers, but they're going to shut up and go away. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They died 600 years ago, but I still am their God. They're still with us. A related thing, when interpreting the Bible, we have to watch the tenses. I am, not I was. I am, we have to pay close attention to the tenses. Now, I have done this especially with verses on salvation, the tenses. And actually, Ephesians 2:8 and 9, "For by grace you have been saved through faith." It's past tense. And then it says in John 5:24 that he who believes in me has passed from death unto life. It's all over with. It's all done. Having been justified by faith, past tense, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Those I'll just quote, made a whole list. Past tense salvation. Past tense. Jesus' conclusion has a lot to do with the tense, I am, not I was. Looking at the tenses, is salvation over with? Salvation is over with. It's not like we have to wait and find out at the end of life at the judgment seat whether we've done enough good. Salvation is done. Now, a few more minutes on a secondary topic. Who wrote the books of the law? Here in Luke 20, both the liberals and the conservatives believe that Moses wrote the books of the law. Right now, we have all kinds of seminaries that Moses did not write the books of the law. Liberal seminaries, of course. Conservative seminaries, I can think of some that have it right all the way through their faculty, but I can think of some that have it mixed. Some go one way, some go the other. Very common now to teach Moses did not write the books of the law. Well, to deny that Moses wrote the books of the law is to deny Jesus, isn't it? Because he clearly taught that right here. He clearly will teach it. We have Jesus on the Emmaus Road. Beginning with Moses, he was explaining to them all things concerning himself in the Scriptures. There's lots of verses that Jesus said Moses wrote the books of the law. There are lots of verses that Paul said Moses wrote the books of the law. Romans 5:10, got it backwards. That's happening more often these days. Romans 10:5, for Moses wrote, then he goes on to quote Leviticus. So it doesn't matter which New Testament author you use, they all believe Moses wrote the law. A while back, I made a 26,000 word document. It's in bad need of editing, but all kinds of evidences for really old things in the law of Moses and really Egyptian things in the law of Moses. Quoting Merrill Unger, he was at Johns Hopkins, archaic phenomena are more abundant in the Pentateuch than any other books in the Old Testament. And they give words that are archaic words. That, lamb, laughter, young girl. In fact, there's 195 of them. Really, really old words, like Moses was written, really, really old book. Also, there are Egyptian places and names and Egyptian customs. We have in the book of Genesis On and Pithom. Those are Egyptian names. If you get later in time, they give them Greek names, like On is Sun City or Heliopolis. So they have old words, old names. They have Egyptian names, Tutmos and Moses. They're Egyptian names. So someone comes along today and say, these are not old books. These weren't written a long time ago. They weren't written after just leaving Egypt. And you have all these Egyptian names. The names of the two midwives that wouldn't throw the boys in the river, those are Egyptian names. Shippa and Puah. All kinds of Egyptian words. Overseer of the house, magician, bulrushes, pitch, river, riverbank. Like I said, there's 195 of them. One time I asked, what is the earliest verse that says Moses wrote it? Well, it's Joshua 1:7. This book of the law of Moses shall not depart of your mouth, and you shall keep it day and night. So already by the time of Joshua, Moses wrote it. We have now people, this guy's from Northern Ireland. I don't know, they waste time reading their books, but he says Moses wrote Deuteronomy, but he didn't write Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Okay? I know more about him. He's an Old Testament editor of one of the Bible study books that you can go buy. NIV version Bible study, he's the Old Testament editor. And Moses didn't write the first 4 books. He only wrote Deuteronomy. So then I asked the question, what is the earliest quote of a non-Deuteronomy book? It's in Joshua also. Joshua 23:7 says, don't mention the names of other gods. That is not in Deuteronomy. That is in Exodus. So by the time of Joshua, they were already saying Moses wrote all these books. Now, we're going to agree with that because that's what Jesus taught, but there's all kinds of evidence for it. What you have in our time, though, is in the seminaries and in the books, and Moses didn't write it. It's very common, and you can almost tell what a group believes or what a person believes by the indirect question, who wrote the law? And if they don't say Moses wrote all of it, right away you know they're going to pick and choose. And they're not going. Jesus said he wrote the law. Paul said he wrote the law. But then you've got people. One comes to mind in Chicago. It's a Baptist one in Chicago. Moses didn't write the law. That's their seminary in Chicago. So the main thing here is life after death. That's the main teaching. But I thought I would point out the Sadducees, as liberal as they were, said Moses wrote the law. And nowadays you have a lot of people. Moses didn't write that. Somebody just made it up. And they will sometimes be in conservative circles. Very good. Will the choir please come?